Okay, terrific. We're being recorded. Hello, everyone. My name is Mercedes de Guardiola. I am very excited to be here with you today, and thank you for coming as I talk about research for my new book, Vermont for the Vermonters. Next slide, please.
Oh gosh, hang on. Why are you not going to the next slide? Okay, there we go.
Okay, so to start off, what is eugenics? Eugenics is the pseudoscientific field of better human breeding. It was founded in Great Britain in 1883. It was enacted in various forms by the vast majority of American states. And it really became the foundation of Nazi Germany, with Nazis copying the laws and policies that were put into place in America and elsewhere around the world. So when we study eugenics, it's very important to remember that these are not unique ideas. Here we have on the right Sir Francis Galton. He's the half cousin of Charles Darwin. He's very influenced by his cousin's work, and he also really draws from pre-existing fields and beliefs when he creates this field in 1883. So here on the left, we see this chart of all the different factors that are going into what Galton and his adherents view as eugenics. Now, this overlap between eugenics and other fields really does pose a problem in determining when and how eugenics arrives in Vermont and elsewhere, because these ideas are not new. This idea that certain people deserve to exist and others do not is certainly not new. It's been known to us since the dawn of mankind. So from the start, eugenics gathers a lot of support and funding. Proponents present it as a humane answer to social ills, that new advancements in science could really promise us a better future. This is coming amidst public welfare crises in America and abroad. But there is also deep awareness that it's not possible to perform the same studies on humans as it is, say, fruit flies or peas. And that's really an important distinction here, and one that I'm going to talk about later. What they're researching is not backing up what they're presenting to the public. So to give you a sense of when it arrives in America, we do see American states begin to consider policies such as sterilization as early as the 1890s, but these laws really fail or are struck down into the 1910s. So while there is public awareness on sterilization, eugenics actually really takes two forms, positive and negative. These are terms that we use today. So let's take a look at negative eugenics first, which is the term or the type of policies that you're most familiar with, and then we'll get to positive eugenics. So these are policies to get rid of undesirable people and restrict their ability to procreate. So in Vermont and America, we see things such as marriage restrictions, family separation, sterilization, and most importantly, segregation through the institutional system. So the idea is that you take the person out of society until they've aged out of procreation. Segregation was most likely the most commonplace form of negative eugenics in Vermont. I'll discuss the barriers to understanding its range in a bit. So then we have positive eugenics, and this is a term most people are not familiar with, either from the term or from the policies that resulted. These are eugenical programs or education to encourage desirable people to procreate. We really don't have a lot of attention shown on this area, and it's also a lot harder to trace. We see, for example, this form take place as college lectures to encourage young people to have children and not contribute to race suicide. We see references to families participating in Better Baby and Fitter Family contests. And Vermont eugenicists in particular plan to educate everyday Vermonters on strengthening their family's health and practicing eugenical ideals. But contemporaries really don't refer to this as eugenics, and eugenicists also work to embed these as part of everyday life. And this form usually gets treated as a passive form of eugenics or even a positive one, and that name is really a misnomer. So who's being left out of this discussion? Undesirable people. And these desirable people are being specifically taught to hate and exclude undesirable people. There's a very particular set of qualifications: looks, ability, race and ethnicity, religion, that's being praised and valued here. So how is this being taught in schools passively by teachers? How are generations passing this on? That's something that's very hard to trace or prevent, and that's really what eugenicists intended. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's turn now to Vermont. So the story of eugenics in Vermont, as many of you may already be aware, it's that in 1925, University of Vermont professor Henry F. Perkins founded the Eugenics Survey of Vermont to carry out investigations into Vermont families and advocate for eugenical public policies. They successfully lobbied for the legalization of sterilization in 1931. It closes in 1936, and eugenics slowly dies a death in the state. Now, that's not the full story. So in 1999, Nancy Gallagher published her outstanding research into the Eugenics Survey of Vermont. More records have come to light since then, which offer more insight into this period. As I began my own work, the question that really interested me was slightly different. How did eugenics arrive in Vermont, and why did it come to have such strong support across private and public sectors? How did so many leaders come to the idea that getting rid of undesirable people was a humane and scientific answer to social ills? So I began by looking at the Eugenics Survey of Vermont. It's a very easy place to start, mostly because it is labeled eugenics. That's not something that we often find in records in this line of research. And Perkins really comments extensively about why he feels that eugenics came to Vermont. So firstly, in looking at this quote here, we're taking into consideration one of the major factors in eugenics, and that's race. So if eugenics is really about improving the human race, how can it take place in a state that's today considered largely homogeneous? What Perkins is capturing here is how eugenicists view race, and that's not based on the color of your skin, it's a social construct. And in Vermont, what's being idealized as desirable is really this adherence to the mythology of the Vermonters. So Vermont eugenicists are speaking to the Protestant British colonizers who in Vermont practice farming and engage in this lifestyle of rural purity. If you've heard of the Roman story of Cincinnatus, it's very much in the same vein. Now, this mythology obviously is not unique to Vermont. We see it across the New England region. But Vermont does hold itself apart from many states because it's not one of the original 13. It's actually our 14th state, and the story of how Vermont, the state, came to be is very much in line with how Vermont views itself back then, not as American, but as Vermont. And we see this repeated and referred to in quotes from eugenicists. Now, who is this excluding? Native Americans, immigrants, Blacks, people who don't succeed in farming, people who deviate from this norm of purity. And I'll get to that in a little bit as well. So where to begin? We know from the eugenics survey that one of the major starting factors is a depopulation crisis that occurs in Vermont in the late 1800s. And there's widespread fears that the best of Vermonters are leaving, that the seedbed of Vermont is not being kept up to its former excellence, that weeds are growing. So let's go now on to the next slide. So why is there this depopulation crisis, and more importantly, fears over a depopulation crisis? I'll preface this by saying that Vermont was a successful state. We see prosperity during industrialization and the explosion of extractive industries. But over the second half of the 1800s in Vermont and in the New England region, we see widespread outward migration to the West and the loss of rural farms. But state officials are really failing to consider the role of natural causes. They're not addressing underlying socioeconomic issues or correcting misguided public policies. There are many people who are not successful. Public policies such as the criminalization of debt and town aid heavily destabilize families. There are people who are being left behind in boom and bust industries and the selective development of railroads that opens up the state. Wars leave breadwinners incapacitated and restrict heavy farm labor. So let's return now to this idea of farming. What is this? Basically, from the start of the state, Vermont requires towns to take care of their poor, whether or not they have the financial ability to do so. There's a number of policies that result, and we'll focus today among these on the poor farm. So poor farms it's a form of an almshouse. They're typically located in desolate regions to encourage people not to ask for aid. These are not homeless shelters as we think of them today. We see them as dumping grounds. The homeless, the sick, the elderly, entire families, including babies, are sent there. We have mentally ill people being put into cages on the farms. And there's reports on town aid, but for the most part, we have people being hidden out of sight and out of mind. But what else is fueling this crisis, and more importantly, the panic? Next slide, please. So the state begins to take over public welfare beginning in the mid-1800s. During the 1830s, we see the formation of the Brattleboro Retreat, which is a facility meant to house the mentally ill. This is a private organization. There's also a small number of other private institutions put into place. By the 1870s, the retreat is wildly overcrowded. It's housing hundreds of people. And the state responds by opening the state-run asylum, which we'll refer to as the Waterbury Hospital, in 1891. And it's meant to take the poor mentally ill. Following the Civil War, there is also a dire need for orphanages. The state also responds by opening the Reform School in 1865, which is meant to take juvenile delinquents. So you may have noticed that for both, I said meant to. What happens when the state opens up these institutions is that the towns end up using the institutional system to get rid of everyone they don't want to take care of, or who they can't afford to take care of. In theory, the towns do need to go through the local courts and meet commitment requirements, but in practice, they become very skilled at finding official reasons to send people away. So these institutions likewise become dumping grounds. Besides that being a major issue for treatment and also childhood development, it becomes a point when institutional officials are increasingly focusing on heredity. They begin tracking everyone who comes through, and they're creating these informal family studies. Now, someone who may have been homeless or may have been sexually abused and gets sent to the reform school, or and sent to Waterbury, have their lives reduced to a singular reason. And these histories really don't provide the contextual information on what's happening, and many times also don't show the real reason why somebody's being committed. And as the situation worsens, these family histories only continue to grow. And under eugenics, that's going to become a black mark on these individuals and their families. So that's why this period is really critical to understanding eugenics in Vermont. It's laying the support for eugenics, but also the foundation for the later investigations done by the institutions and the Eugenics Survey of Vermont. Next slide, please. So we see eugenics publicly emerge around the turn of the century in the 1912 legislative session. State leaders have seen an almost immediate breakdown of the new system. It's overcrowded and constantly needs new funding. So as we see here, Governor John Meade in 1912 is responding to the specific welfare crisis. The bolded words are my own emphasis. What began as town aid has now snowballed into a crisis. So he spends the 2 years of his tenure researching what other progressive states are doing. And in the end, he calls for 3 measures: marriage restrictions, sterilization via vasectomy, so only for men, and segregation. Next slide, please. Now, in preparation, Meade also looks inward in Vermont. He's speaking here with Dr. Grout, who's the superintendent of the Waterbury Hospital. One major thing that we know from their letters is that Grout is not really aware of what's going on in eugenics. He asks me to send him what he knows. That's a very clear sign to us that national eugenics organizations haven't quite reached into Vermont yet. But again, we see here that Grout's already adhering to these ideals. So he doesn't really need to know about the field of eugenics. He's already come to these conclusions on his own. And there's a good chance that he's already using Waterbury as a tool of segregation, or if he hasn't already, he's going to use it soon. Now, again, eugenical segregation or putting someone in an institution to prevent their procreation, these cases are very hard to track because there are these official reasons cited for institutionalization. We're never going to get a record that says deliberately, this is a case of eugenical segregation. We typically have to find an outright reference to procreation, and that's very rare unless there is an immediate risk, such as somebody who has left the institution and is about to marry and have kids. But we know from comments like these and more explicit comments made in the public forums that the institutional officials really see these as tools of segregation, and that it is likely being carried out at a large scale across the state-run institutions. So next slide, please. So this is a period, 1912 to 1925, that hasn't previously received much attention because the proposed laws proposed under Meade seem to have failed. So that's not true, and there is a lack of successful opposition to eugenics. Marriage restrictions are already on the books. Again, it's this adherence to previously existing ideals that makes it hard to track eugenics. There is no reason to put in a copy law. Sterilization of both males and females is nearly legalized, but the supporters make the bill so highly detailed that the Attorney General deems it discriminatory. If they had kept it simple, it likely would have passed. What is put into place is the Brandon School for Feeble-Minded Children. And from the beginning, its leaders declare quite openly that they intend for it to segregate the feeble-minded from the general population. So what is this term feeble-mindedness? We see this term used quite frequently by eugenicists in Vermont, though there are actually a wider range of diagnoses used by eugenicists, as we see here. And eugenicists really believe that the danger of the feeble-minded lay in their ability to pass as normal. The signs that their experts, and only their experts, could diagnose as feeble-mindedness, including things such as out-of-wedlock pregnancy, middling performance in school, menial labor, all of that. And if this class is not identified and separated from society, eugenicists warned, a normal person might procreate and with them unknowingly. We're seeing a lot of similar language that's used in terms of marriage with feeble-minded and marriage between races. So it's really a judgment on behavior and perceived morals, and they're going to be much harsher based on race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. So let's look at what this means for Vermont. Brandon, like the other institutions, is very quickly overcrowded. We now see signs that point to vitamin deficiencies, neglect, and health problems, in addition to mental and health disabilities. Brandon is also going to make certain issues worse. And from the start, it is, again, meant to segregate these populations. What does that mean? And what does that result in? Eugenics at its core is really about the dehumanization of certain people because it relies on the idea that certain people don't deserve to exist. So in America, we don't see murder programs, though we do see certain cases in institutions of neglect leading to death. Over time, their end goal is that certain families would be pruned and that others would thrive. But in the meantime, people can be put to work. So even though we see eugenics use the terminology in medicine, they really discuss cases in terms of trainability. So this is what this chart here is reflecting. And at the institutions, when we see segregation, we're seeing children and adults being put to work. And until their bloodlines can be bred out of existence, the idea is that they can work. And Vermont institutions, like other American ones, utilize a system of involuntary labor. People are committed to the institutions. There is not this ability to consent or not consent to work. But besides involuntary labor, we also see this resulting in systematic abuse of public institutions and private welfare organizations. Again, this does not happen to every person who walks through their doors, but we are continuing to see substantial allegations of abuse come out today. Whether or not each organization practices eugenics outright, eugenicists very much directly contribute to an approach of dehumanization in public welfare. And segregation and the push for mass institutionalization greatly weakens the public welfare system. It's costly and it doesn't help the people institutionalized recover. And this is once more going to cause a snowball effect. Public welfare institutions become overcrowded and underfunded, which likewise contributes to situations where abuse is more likely to occur. Next slide, please. Okay, so between 1912 and the next major eugenics campaign under the Eugenics Survey of Vermont, we see increased focus on public welfare systems and the state of local communities. The 1912 session and the later campaign are not separate entities. Eugenics continues in different forms, leading to greater support in the 1920s. So we see World War I and the Spanish flu. This is going to place an unprecedented demand on the public welfare system in Vermont. We also see immense growth of tourism. This is going to shine a new spotlight on rural poverty. And it's very clear that there are widespread inadequacies in the state's public welfare system, which leads to the development of new private organizations that become key to the later eugenics campaign. The state basically empowers them to go out and investigate families and to work with the institutions to create these family histories. Now, in America, we also see new isolationist policies and also the rise of the second KKK, pictured here in Vermont. So the second KKK was very tied into eugenics. It advances eugenics laws, ideals, and uses eugenics to back up their views. Significant social support for eugenics and the KKK during this period. We have a picture of the KKK where its members are not afraid to take a photo with their masks off. It does eventually die out, largely due to a dues system that I go into more deep. Slide, please. So in 1925, Professor Perkins founds the Eugenics Survey of Vermont. Segregation can theoretically breed out certain families, but lifetime confinement is still very costly and very, very slow. And eugenicists in Vermont really desperately want to expand the role of eugenics in public policies and in personal officials to consumed by work. There's no obvious leader to organize a coordinated effort. It leaves the door open for Perkins, who brings together state leaders of every institution and academic support. Leaders work in their official capacities, they turn over these inheritance. And not all these early families. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is the survey trying to do? This is a how-to guide from an organization called the Eugenics Record Office. They're down at Cold Springs Harbor. It's funded by the Carnegies and Harrimans, and they have a large degree of influence over Perkins. So you might recall when I said earlier that national eugenics organizations hadn't reached Grout or Vermont yet. This is where they do. By this point in the 1920s, the Eugenics Record Office is a national lobbying organization that essentially helps eugenicists in local states advance eugenic laws at a local level. And we know Perkins and the head of the ERO, a man called Charles Davenport, are in close correspondence, especially after Perkins expresses an interest in eugenics in the 1920s. The ERO also trains several survey field workers. Now, their pamphlets are designed to help local eugenicists carry out their own research and push for eugenics, in particular, these family studies, which are meant to show the expensive threat of poor heredity. This is what the survey aims to replicate to advance a range of eugenical policies. Those are the investigations that Perkins referenced in the quote that we just saw, the 62 investigations. Next slide, please. So what is this family study? We're looking right now at a very famous family study of a family called the Kallikaks. So the story, as we can see here in the center, is that Martin Kallikak, a Revolutionary War patriot, is married to an upstanding woman. That's the circle with N for normal on the left. However, on his way home at one point, he has an affair with a feeble-minded barmaid. That's the one on the right. And through this affair, he produces a line of feeble-minded children. Now, this really captures what eugenicists saw as how heredity gets passed on. This very loose catch-all diagnosis of feeble-mindedness is inescapable from generation to generation. You can't just marry someone who's normal and then it'll be crossed out. So this is really the threat that they are trying to frighten people with. So in these family studies, there's a number that are published across the nation. We consistently get told the same narrative. There's an irredeemable family, they possess a degenerate trait of some sort, they're procreating at an alarming rate, and they're costing the taxpayer increasing sums of money each year. And some of the more detailed studies actually do produce a sum that was meant to represent how much the state was paying for them. They're very often targeting minorities, including Native American tribes. And at conferences and county fairs, eugenicists really reproduce much more these trees, but also much more intricate trees with graphs without any sort of contextual data. So if you look at here, we really don't know what they're talking about. There is background given in some of the more detailed family studies, but you would see graphs like this reproduced. And it's designed to stoke fears. It's designed to lead you to certain conclusions. Next slide, please. So that's what the eugenics survey is trying to replicate. Now, what we see here on the left is a face sheet from the eugenics survey. These weren't published. They were put in on top of each of the major investigations into the families. But they are summarized in the 7 studies that were put into 5 annual reports published by the Eugenics Survey. So when we're interpreting the Eugenics Survey's records, we have to understand that they're being made out in this guise of scientific legitimacy. People are very deliberately being presented as statistics with a singular determination on their entire life. Now, how does the survey carry out their investigations? The survey collects a lot of data from the family histories collected by the institutions, those very thin files that are made on each individual that passes through their doors, dating back to the 1800s. But they also collect a lot of information from informal talks led by women field workers, much of which was gossip. So why women? They really don't have to pay them as much. And it's a very acceptable job at the time for young college-age women. But women also have more access to the home. A mother home alone is going to trust a woman. And after all, what harm could women's talk bring? Let's talk about Aunt Susie down the street. She's having some trouble. She may be drinking a little bit too much. And that neighbor down the, goodness gracious, did you see the police outside? Did you see him be arrested? Here's this inside scoop that's being talked around town. And that's going to be used to very deadly effect by the field workers. So here, this is really the key point in understanding who Vermont eugenicists targeted. And the first part to understand is that Vermont did not have the roundup or quota system that we see in Nazi Germany. Eugenicists targeted who they could reach. We've discussed how towns had to commit their citizens to institutions. That's how many fell under scrutiny. But on the flip side, if you could protect yourself from town officials, you could largely stay out of the system. But again, the Eugenics Survey field workers are only using those histories as a starting point. They're going out and gathering further information. And that's how a number more people also come under the scrutiny of eugenicists in public office in the state. So what results in 62 investigations under the Eugenics Survey of Vermont? On the one hand, they are deeply invasive and derogatory. On the other, we can also use them to see how the survey drew major conclusions without contextual data. They would have piles and piles of information on each member of the family, and in many cases, there's only a singular sentence or a few lines that summarizes an entire life. And we can see this and know that they're not really backing up what they're claiming in the most absolute of terms. But they don't care. They're looking to provide a terrifying conclusion, and that's what they really do. So back again to who was targeted. In the Eugenics Survey of Vermont, that organization specifically hones in on several mixed-race intermarried communities in the state, among others. I'm saying intermarried communities or families here because even though people call them family studies, we're looking at hundreds of people in the main case. This is not a nuclear family. And these families are presented as a scare story. They're not farmers. They're not present in the normal town life. Their non-white ancestry is also called out. The survey identifies them as having Native American, Black, and French Canadian ancestry. Now, the survey does not really satisfactorily conclude where the Native American ancestry comes from, but they also don't care. And that's really a point that we need to understand. They refer to these families in the most derogatory of terms, in their own internal correspondence. It's worse than what's actually published publicly. Now, groups of descendants today have come forward to say that this Native American heritage is Abenaki. And again, the survey does not make a conclusion on where this heritage came from. So these are communities heavily targeted by the Eugenics Survey. Some were already on the radar of the institutions, and the survey intends that their investigations will be used in eugenics. But the survey is not the end-all be-all of Vermont eugenics. It's not a roundup system, and that's why I don't always like to use the word targeting. Vermont eugenicists really sweep up everyone who does not meet their ideal that they can get their hands on. There has to be local participation from the towns. And just because you may descend from this prized old stock does not save you if you fall under scrutiny. So that's why I'm not going to give you a laundry list of who was targeted. We do see, again, major families being targeted by the Eugenics Survey of Vermont, but there are also other people who are swept up into this system. It's much more important to look at eugenicists' point of view and understand the reasons for why they want to get rid of certain people. That's their guidebook, and that's what I addressed at the start of this lecture. Next slide, please. So out of the eugenics survey also comes the Vermont Commission on Country Life. And the survey brings together more than 200 prominent Vermonters behind this positive eugenics initiative to revive Vermont's old stock. Okay, so let's pause here. The commission is not separate from the eugenics survey. We have internal documents that state that they are the same entity or branches of each other. We see college presidents, we see newspaper editors, we see prominent businessmen and writers. Former Governor John Weeks chairs it. If you'd like a full list, it is in the book. And the first and foremost purpose of this book is to encourage the regrowth of the ideal Vermonter. It is a eugenics book. And the Eugenics Survey of Vermont goes out and promotes this book to be used in the education system as a eugenics tract. Next slide, please. So what else results? Among other policies, we see the 1931 voluntary sterilization law. And this is usually the major point of focus in eugenics in Vermont. So here are some points I'd like you to take away with today. For many reasons, this law is illogical. As eugenicists discussed internally, physicians and surgeons are not qualified to make this determination of mental ability. Someone who's deemed to have limited mental ability also needs to voluntarily consent to being sterilized. And there's really no oversight to ensure that there's no abuse of it. I have found case records that suggest that this idea of voluntary consent could actually rely on substantial coercion, or also no knowledge of what they are actually agreeing to. So this lack of oversight also makes it impossible for us to assess the surviving records as a complete set. These are not probate cases. They're not going into the court records. These are very flimsy pieces of paper that were meant to be sent to the government. It's an opt-in system of record keeping. And for those of us who have handled the records, these records are quite flimsy today, and they are at risk of being lost. From one case that we know of where the state found out about a certificate not being sent in, there was also no punishment or reform for this problem of somebody not sending it in. And across the country, we also see that it's commonplace to practice sterilization without the person's consent or awareness, such as by calling it an appendectomy or performing it after childbirth. And we still see cases of the latter pop up today. So to use the records we have to make any determination as to the extent of eugenics in Vermont is a major mistake. They help us understand what happened, not to the extent to which it did. Those records also only date to the 1950s. Sterilization remains on the books until 1980, until a court case and the legislature then legalizes forced sterilization. Lastly, sterilization is only one form of eugenics in Vermont, and from what we know right now, it was likely dwarfed in scale by segregation. Next slide, please. So following World War II, there's a general assumption that eugenics ended. That's not true. There's a very deliberate rebranding of eugenics, which makes it difficult to trace. And from World War II, we actually have a new spotlight being shown on day-to-day life at America's mental asylums. So we're looking here at a visual essay that was presented in Life magazine in 1946. Faced with the draft, more than 3,000 conscientious objectors were sent to work at mental hospitals. And they're absolutely horrified by what they found. Subsequent reports and investigations, including this one, are published in prominent magazines, and they're detailing scenes of hundreds of people crammed into bare rooms that were fire traps, filled with filth and feces, as staff starved, beat, and murdered them. If you are interested in looking at this essay, I would warn you that the subsequent photos are quite disturbing, but it does provide a very unprecedented look into what the mental asylums were like at the time. Next slide, please. So let's return now to Vermont. As we were looking at this post-war period, it again becomes very difficult to trace eugenics because we see this deliberate rebranding. So I decided to follow the programs we already knew of. The state institutions only continue to grow, and towns continue to blatantly abuse the system. But controversies and investigations do unite Vermonters behind the need to address mental health and long-term care besides the simplistic answer of mass institutionalization. With community support and new tranquilizing drugs that come in the 1950s, new medical interventions open the door to community-based living. So where does eugenics end then? The growing number of investigations doesn't kill off eugenics or the institutions until the latter half of the century. For example, we see eugenics proposed, not by name, by the Governor's Advisory Committee on Mental Retardation Planning in the 1960s. Again, they don't use the term eugenics, but they propose very similar policies for very similar reasons. And newspapers referred to these as eugenical policies, again, without using the term eugenics. So by that point, it's really dropped out of use. A sterilization case in 1980 deems the 1931 law unconstitutional. The state legislature then legalizes forced sterilization, which, again, without referring to eugenics. And that law remains in place today. So shifting back to the institutions, beginning under President John F. Kennedy, we do see a massive federal push to close down the state-run institutions. In Vermont, this idea is already being tossed about because of awareness of what the system has resulted in. But deinstitutionalization is also not adequately funded or rolled out, though it does dismantle this idea of segregation by nature of shutting down the institutions. It doesn't fully address the underlying issues that have led to the rise of the institutional system and its failure, nor the failure of successive public welfare measures. And it does really fail to address care and treatment needs for those who need significant long-term care. As you may have seen in the news today, there is continued debate over how to address this need for long-term mental health care and the federal laws that do prohibit use of funding for certain measures. So that deinstitutionalization led to a collapse in care for the significantly mentally ill and disabled individuals, and the rise of homeless populations was already evident by the mid-1970s. And that's because the institutions were dumping grounds. They did not just address mental health. Okay, so looking at what other conclusions we can draw. We are very close to when many of these institutions shut down and when sterilization began to decrease as a practice. Again, there are still cases of sterilization done by individuals and at certain state levels, particularly in California, most recently and prominently, that continue to come to light today. So we're very close to when eugenics has been put into place. And that makes it difficult as a historian to take a bird's eye view and say conclusively, this is when eugenics ended. So the way I would prefer to look at it is really to look at eugenics as it was intended to be implemented. It's meant to be intergenerational. Eugenicists intend to break the family unit. If they can't prevent procreation entirely, they want to limit the family from prospering and cause intergenerational trauma. So looking at how to address this long-term impact, this long-term trauma is really critical to determining when eugenics ends, because that impact is still here today. And that's something people in Vermont and elsewhere are continuing to look at and determine how to evaluate it and address it. So on that note, I'd like to open it up for questions.
Great, thank you, Mercedes. So we have a few questions in the chat. Again, if folks have other questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. And so the first one from Elise is, where did Burlington send their undesirable people?
So where did Burlington send these undesirable people? It really would depend on what they're being sent off for and at what time period. Again, in the 1800s, we see the form of town aid. Later, we see the institutions, and the state-run institutions alongside a number of private-run organizations it's really determined by your age and what the official reason for commitment is. So the Waterbury Hospital, the focus is much more on adults. The Brandon State School for Feeble-Minded Children, that is technically for children, but they do take adults throughout its tenure. So it really just depends what the official reason for commitment is. Without knowing the specific cases, it's hard to say where they might have ended up. And okay, so let's talk about Dorothy Canterfield Fisher. So what is the firm data on the involvement of Dorothy Canterfield Fisher in the eugenics movement? Dorothy, among others, was part of the Vermont Commission on Country Life. She's an identified author of one of the chapters on rural traditions. Again, the Vermont Commission on Country Life had about 200 prominent Vermonters in it. I do list out the names. So she was one of many that participated in this positive eugenics initiative. Okay, the next question, is there any evidence of Lebanese families being targeted? This goes back to producing a laundry list of who was or wasn't targeted. It's difficult to make the determination without knowing off my head if there were Lebanese families in the state. I would say certainly that background, if you came from a lower socioeconomic class, would make you potentially a target for eugenicists. But again, it comes back to this question of, were the institutions able to reach you? Are you going to be in a town where town officials see your family and they want to get rid of you? Where potentially you may be considered. So again, it's not just about race and ethnicity. It's also tied in very deeply to socioeconomic class. It's based on your ability to keep out of the court system. And I would also add to that by saying that town officials would sometimes go out on their own accord. And even if we have a case where the person in question really was not doing, she had previously been in an institution, she wasn't doing anything wrong, she was employed by by a family in the town. But because she's about to marry, town officials look at her and they want to bring her back into the institution. So I do want to emphasize that you don't necessarily have to be doing any sort of criminal behavior or necessarily be on town aid to be swept in. The family had certainly been receiving town aid in the past, but once you're on their radar, it can become something where you are then targeted for eugenics. So let's talk about the title Vermont for the Vermonters. Yes, so the quote that's taken from comes from rural Vermont, and it's from a judge called Wendell Philip Stafford. So the book itself, as I've discussed, is a positive eugenics initiative. And it's really, when you take in the whole context of the book, it's really about promoting a certain type of Vermonter. And it again speaks to this idea of what is being idealized as a Vermonter by eugenicists and by other people in the state. And that was something where it's very difficult. It's a very good question, so thank you for that. Let me get some water. When you take the entire book into consideration, it does become very clear that it's a eugenics tract. Chapter by chapter or quote by quote, this may not be readily apparent. But what this portion of the book and others was fighting for was this idea that Vermont would be restored. And it's being headed up by people who really believe that certain people in Vermont don't deserve to exist. So again, it becomes, today it's very easy to go back and say, okay, this person wasn't evil or this person was very good, and we don't want to tie them into the eugenics movement. So in this book, it was very important for me to help people understand that people and eugenicists were very complex human characters. Governor Meade, for example, was very much a progressive governor. We have other people who are involved who do, and in Vermont and in the nation, who are very much working towards improved social welfare conditions. But at the same time, they are bringing in their own biases, and there is this idea of who exactly is meant to be the superior race. So it is a very complex subject. Just because somebody is a eugenicist doesn't necessarily mean that they are advocated for the same exact things that every eugenicist is advocating for. And that's something that I encourage people to take away from the book. Okay. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a bit from all the talking. Okay, so let's talk about the state farms and hospitals. To what extent was Vermont like other states in using its state farms, hospitals as a place to send women who were unmarried and pregnant or otherwise not following the sexual mores of the time? That's a great question. Thank you. So Vermont does absolutely use the poor farms and the hospitals as a place to send women who are unmarried and pregnant. We also see them being sent to certain private organizations, such as the Elizabeth Lund Home. But certainly the Reform School, which is one of the earliest forms, takes in a number of girls who fall under this, who are institutionalized based on this reason of gross lewdness. And that's really a catch-all term. That's where we see a lot of the abuse or pregnancy cases being sent in under. That basically it captures this idea. And we also see institutional officials recognizing that gross lewdness is a very vague term. Most of the girls around the turn of the century are there under that category. So that's one of the reasons people get sent there. And in a number of cases, in addition to pregnancy, we see cases where that suggests that the girl was abused or raped, and the man in question is not being punished. It's the girl that's being sent away. So otherwise, yes, we also see people being targeted for deviating from sexual mores. We don't see explicit discussion of things such as homosexuality, but it is very clear that there is this targeting of what they call sexual deviancy. So unmarried sex, homosexuality, other things that may be considered to fall outside the sexual morality of the day. And it's also very much tied into the morality movements that we really see come into being in the 1930s in America. Okay. So better baby events. Yes, I did mention very briefly in it was a throwaway comment at the beginning. So better baby events at state fairs that measure and follow babies' growth. There were county fairs, and basically these contests being held, they could be referred to as better baby or fitter family contests, and they are pretty much what they're called. They really come into being in the 1910s following this increased focus on infant mortality and health. We see improved mortality rates, but as a result, we also see children continuing to have health problems. Now, the people who form these better baby contests, and it's essentially a very national organization that handles it, are also very tied in with eugenics. So they're very much, when we're thinking of who's getting the gold medal at a better baby contest, and the Vermont Historical Society actually has one such medal, though actually it's not gold, it's a nice silver medal. And when we're thinking about who would be awarded this really is not just about health. It's about looks. It's about race. It's about the entire family. So is this a religious family? Are they a good Christian family? So it really is tied into not just this idea of health. And that's something that's very important to consider of who is being prioritized here. So this question about is it possible for direct descendants of the Waterbury Hospital, of people institutionalized at the Waterbury Hospital, to get records? Yes, it is possible. The state archives does hold the Waterbury Hospital records that still exist. I would note that Waterbury Hospital, as we just recently saw this past August, was placed on the river. And it did see a lot of flooding during natural disasters, in particular the 1927 flood that happened in Vermont, and then later floods in the 1990s and 2012 under Hurricane Irene. So we do have the majority, well, it's one of those things. I want to say we have the majority of records, but we don't know what's been lost. So it's a catch-22 for a historian. I would say if you're looking for records from the Waterbury Hospital, the state archives would be the place to start. And it's possible that case records on ancestors may still exist. Some are being sealed under medical confidentiality, but those can be opened by descendants. Okay, was there a divide between those with behavioral mental health problems and those who were normal but from less desirable stock, for example, Eastern and Southern European? Would certain behaviors or problems be more likely overlooked if the subject was of good stock? So this is a great question. Thank you. I would really assess it of good stock being taking into consideration race and ethnicity, but also looking at socioeconomic class, along with a number of behaviors that are being prioritized. So in Vermont, again, this adherence to an agricultural tradition, which, by the way, it's not an issue to celebrate traditions. Where eugenicists really take this is people who they see people as not who are not adhering or succeeding in these traditions as undesirable. So they take it many steps further than just celebrating a tradition. So yes, if you are from certain races and ethnicities and you're not adhering to these ideals, it does make you more likely to be targeted. But again, it does fall into, are you going to come under scrutiny? Are you going to come to the attention of eugenicists in the state? And so there's a number of factors that go into, is somebody actually going to be targeted for eugenics? Okay, so here's a question, perhaps outside the scope of your research, but can you tell us a little about the warning out of individuals out of towns in the 1700s and early 1800s as a way of dealing with New England's wandering poor, especially during and shortly after the Revolution? So I do go into detail about this in my book. This actually arises pre-Vermont Republic, but also as a result of the law that passes in, I believe, 1787, that Vermont makes every town take care of its poor. What basically happens in addition to the poor farms are several policies that are put into place. One of these is the auctioning off of the poor into indentured servitude. The idea is to sell the poor at auction. So it is what it sounds like. The town will pay you to take care of somebody, but you're saying that you need the least amount of money to take care of them, and you would be the winning bidder at the auction. Another measure that's being mentioned here is the warning out system. So if towns could prove that you were not a citizen, they don't have to legally take care of you. And again, I would say that there are these beliefs that are guiding these policies, that towns are looking down on individuals, but we also see a number of cases where the towns are really financially strapped and they don't have the means to do so. So again, it's a complicated situation. But yes, one of the methods towns use is then to warn out people and to prove that they're not citizens. And this results in a number of lawsuits between the towns to make the case that they don't have to take care of a certain person. And we see one interesting case where a town marries off somebody to somebody from another town. The marriage then has to get annulled by the state court system. So I go into more detail about that in my book. Were people with dementia institutionalized in Waterbury? This is again a great question. So thank you all for the very thoughtful questions being posed here. Absolutely. And this is the problem with the town aid system and the institutions. Again, the elderly are essentially being sent off as well. So it's not just, we're thinking of these as perhaps homeless shelters or mental hospitals, and that's not really capturing the full scale of what's going on here. The institutions, really particularly Waterbury, do become this form of nursing home in the state. We have the elderly with dementia or other brain disorders being sent off because there isn't somebody in the family who's able to care for them. And again, it is a very tragic situation where we do see a number of families without the means to care for their children or for family members or loved ones, and they do turn to the institutions. It's not just the towns begging for the institutions to help them. So it's a very tragic story. But yes, part of the problem is that we do see the elderly being sent off and obviously being put into an institution that is very much overcrowded, and there is a lack of personalized or really treatment itself is going to make their situation quite a bit worse. Okay, so my book quotes a Vermont mother of the 1980s who is seeking permission to have her daughter sterilized on the grounds that her daughter is severely handicapped, is easy to exploit sexually, and would be unable to safely carry a baby to term. The mother also says that for biomedical reasons, her daughter is unable to use contraceptives that were available at the time. So in tough cases such as this, do you think sterilization is always unjustified? And thank you for that. One minor correction, I don't believe it was for biomedical reasons. I believe it was due to how one of the issues was in the 70s and 80s as birth control became more available, that there were populations who were institutionalized for mental disability or other mental health reasons. The type of birth control that you would be able to take at the time, it's not something that they, how to say this, such as a pill that you're going to be able to trust them to take every day. This is a very complex situation. And again, I bring to life several of these throughout the book, where the institutional systems and eugenical policies really become the only place for families to turn to. And it's something that does require a lot of sensitivity and understanding. This book is not about whether sterilization is justified or unjustified. And I hope what readers take away is that there are very complicated reasons for why families are turning to these solutions. And also that when state officials are really looking at debating these policies of what's best for the state, there's this absolute failure to consider and help families that are trying to deal with very complicated situations around people that they love, and that there is absolutely a lack of treatment options available. And this is a problem that we continue to see today. So, did other states in the US adopt eugenic policies that were related to their state or regional concepts of desirable characteristic of old stocks versus undesirables? How unique was the construct of eugenical thought in Vermont? Vermont's construct was absolutely not unique. We see this across the world, that when eugenicists put eugenics into place in their local regions, that they are adhering to what's the ideal in that region. We see this throughout America. We see this in Nazi Germany. They're responding to certain things that are being prized in their community. And you're touching on something that is absolutely the issue when you're trying to understand eugenics. This is not just about the color of your skin. It's about bringing in together all these different factors. So certainly in the South, we see increased targeting of African Americans. But in the North, we do also see a variety of other reasons that are being targeted. And also, people who are theoretically part of this old stock, if you were looking at their family heredity, but due to a number of factors, are being held up as the weaker links, essentially. So we are up on time, but I'll answer one last question. So would it be possible to support eugenics and be innocent of the dark side of it? Absolutely. And this question really gets at a very hard part of when you're looking at eugenics and understanding what people were aware of. Certainly, when policies were being put into place, we do see eugenicists talking quite openly about sterilization or about segregation. But at other times, they completely drop off the map. When sterilization is legalized in Vermont, thereafter, they make very few references to it. It's very controversial in the state. There's a lot of Catholics. And the eugenicists know that they've already gotten the measure that they want. They don't want to call more attention to it. And also, it's also being presented in a very positive light in schools, that this is common sense. Of course, you would check somebody's eugenics certificate before you married them, and these were things that were issued. Of course, you would look at somebody's family. Of course, you wouldn't marry somebody who can. So it's being presented as common sense solutions. And again, when it's being taught, it's not always with this term of eugenics. But that being said, there was also awareness in Vermont and elsewhere. Stories did come out from point to point of abuses being carried out at the institutions, of allegations of murder, and very poor quality of life being there. But that being said, they're very, unless you're paying attention to the newspaper at that certain point in time, this is not the age of the internet. and there is really this inability to be able to see the bird's eye view of what is happening across and how everything is very interconnected at this stage and later on. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Mercedes. We appreciate everybody's really great questions and apologize that we didn't quite have time to get to all of them. If you do have follow-up questions for Mercedes, you can feel free to contact the Vermont Historical Society, info@vermonthistory.org, and we will get those along to her. We also recommend, if you haven't already read her book, Vermont for Vermonters, The History of Eugenics in the Green Mountain State, that you do so. Copies are available via our online store, at the History Museum, History Center, and actually on Amazon as well, I believe. So thank you again to Mercedes and everyone. Our next virtual talk will be December 6th with Andrew Liptak, who's going to be talking about cosplay and storytelling, which I think will be a lot of fun. Thanks again.
Thank you.